Hi, everyone. This is Tina Ramirez, and I am really honored today to have with me my friend Julie Rayman, who was actually the second co-chair of the International Religious Freedom Caucus in Congress when I worked up on the Hill. And she worked for Congressman Heath Shuler at the time and was a huge part of that. But since then, Julie went on and she's done tons of things. And she's now with, I believe, the AJC. Is that right, Julie? I don't want to get it wrong.
Right, yes, the American Jewish Committee.
And has been leading coalitions with so much going on in our country today and just around the world related to anti-Semitism. I thought it would be great to hear what Julie's been doing since she left the Hill on building coalitions to helping people better understand what's happening in the world and why we need to be concerned about protections for people everywhere and how to build communities that are educated to know how to respond. So Julie, without further ado, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, do you want to maybe just share a little bit about what is the AJC for those that should know but may not know?
Beautiful, of course. So the American Jewish Committee we've been around for coming on 120 years. We are one of the oldest Jewish civil rights and humanitarian organizations in the United States. It was started by a group of American Jews who were sort of seeing at that moment what was going on with Jews across the world in terms of pogroms in Eastern Europe and Russia, and with great concern, realizing that they were somewhat powerless in the United States to help. So they created this committee to essentially start a lobbying effort and start talking to government officials, members of Congress, the administration, to say, we're really concerned about what's going on with Jews. And very quickly realized that, as is the pervasive truth throughout time, when Jews were being attacked, when Jewish communities were threatened, other minority religious and ethnic communities were as well. So very quickly after they started, they sort of took this parochial concern and universalized it and said, we want to be a force for good for all the communities out there that are feeling vulnerable or are under attack. And so started creating nationwide advocacy initiatives to help really all the minorities across the world who are sort of under attack. And that goes in a straight line to what we do today, which is very much sort of continuing that fight against anti-Semitism, for pluralism, against hate, against extremism. And then of course we work on the other issues that are core to American Jewish concern as well, like promoting a strong US-Israel relationship, addressing the threat posed by Iran, all of those types of things that you would assume underlying it, this grave sort of feeling that for us to be strong as a community, all the other communities need to be strong.
And Julie, tell me about just how is your personal experience and just your faith as a Jewish person, how has that influenced so much of your professional work?
So it's such a good question because Jews, I guess most people who associate with a faith really run the gamut, right? Between very observant, very faithful, very believing, to sort of the opposite. And in Judaism, interestingly, it's a little bit less what you believe and much more what you do. So there are very Jewishly engaged atheists who follow the tenets of Judaism and align very strongly with the Jewish community, but who are like maybe a little iffy about God. But there are these fundamental tenets of social justice that really drive the community, even I would say more than faith itself. And there are two that I would highlight for the purposes of this conversation. One is the concept of B'Tselem Elohim, which means in the image of God. And for Jews, this means like we were created in the image of God, but we all people were created in the image of God. So it speaks directly to sort of the issue of injustice. Like, how could you treat someone poorly? They were created in the image of God. How could we stand by when someone is being mistreated? They were created in the image of God. And the other sort of key principle that is a driving factor for me in this work, that's often sort of thrown around in conversations like this, is the concept of tikkun olam. And that is, it's a very sort of mystical kind of Kabbalistic theory that, that is permeated a lot of American Jewry. The idea that our world is broken, that it is fundamentally fractured, and it is our job as responsible humans, to fix it, to be a part of the reparation of that world.
Well, we did this back in, I think it was 2008 or 2009. So it's been, it's been quite some time since we were working together on the Hill. And as you know, I started Hardwired about 8 years ago. And I started it with my colleague at the time, we had been working at the Beckett Fund together, Sarah Schlesinger, who I ended up going to work for an AJC affiliate out in Kansas or wherever she went. There was a shooting and it was horrible. And she's like, I was trying to take a break, and work with the community. And this happened. And it was just, she's like, I need another break. It was horrible. But she was such just a great partner to start Hardwired with, and just wonderful. So anyway, she had often talked about tikkun olam, is that how you say it? And
really close.
Thank you. That's my attempt, my sorry attempt. And so yeah, that's where I had heard about it, but I think it's beautiful the way that you described it, because most people don't understand. But before we get started, tell me a little bit about what's happening today with the Jewish community, because I think that's so important for people to understand.
So we are experiencing globally right now this massive spike in anti-Semitic incidents, rhetoric, and attitudes that is sort of unprecedented, at least in the last generation, right? People are making a lot of comparisons to like 1930s Europe, because it feels that sort of existential. I think for lots of reasons, those analogies aren't necessarily apt, but that sense of vulnerability across the world is so true. And the spike was exacerbated by the recent conflict in Israel. And that's something that we see sort of throughout history, that whenever there's a conflict in Israel, that that conflict, that political strife sort of becomes exported. So thousands of miles away, Jewish communities are held accountable to what someone may see as an injustice perpetrated by the Israeli government, or to criticize the Israeli government, one will point their finger at Jews locally as though somehow they're an instrument of Israel. And in the last conflict, there were a lot of really, really scary stories. There were a number of parades throughout Europe. In the most Jewish part of London, there were caravans going through the streets with people chanting F the Jews and rape their daughters. We know, of course, in New York and Los Angeles, Jews were actually attacked in sort of public displays. The LA example, I think, is particularly sort of traumatic, that there was a sushi restaurant in sort of an area with a lot of Jews, and these men in Hamas garb show up and say, like, where are the Jews? Who are the Jews? Like, sort of raise your hand, identify yourself, and then started attacking people who are sitting outside at the sushi restaurant. So the idea that these types of incidents, that these types of brazen attacks are happening in the United States, in our sort of metropolitan enlightened cities, and then of course in places like London and in Berlin and Brussels and Paris, it's really jarring for Jews who sort of feel like, oh, we're comfortable here, we're accepted here, and then suddenly to feel like, there's an incident in Israel, and suddenly that sense of comfort, that sense of safety is simply unraveled.
When we worked in the International Religious Freedom Caucus, the Jewish community, and it's still true today, was disproportionately the most persecuted group. So by population size of the community worldwide, they remain today the most persecuted group, which is extremely alarming. I just remember at the beginning of last year, even pre-COVID, I remember the year starting, and maybe unfortunately, because I'm in the space, I think in terms of religious freedom. That's my
Yeah.
annual calendar. But I remember the year starting with the attack on the rabbi in his home with a
Yeah.
knife. I mean, in his home. These aren't just, attacks outside in public, which are horrifying, but they're literally going into the homes of Jewish people during Shabbat dinner and other celebrations and brutally attacking them. The fact that they've actually sought them out, I think, is extremely alarming. We had the synagogue shooting or attack in San Diego, California in the past year and a half. These
Yeah.
are these things shouldn't be happening. And yeah, I mean, to see the association of what happened even with BLM and other certain groups attacking uh, the Jewish community with what happened in recent weeks, I think is very alarming as well. So it shows that there's a real lack of understanding and education about the Jewish state and political issues and really the people. And so several years ago, I guess now, you helped start an anti-Semitism caucus in the US Congress. I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about that and what they're doing, how they got started and what they're doing today that
Yeah.
can really be useful in addressing some of these issues, because clearly there's a lot of division in Congress over this issue. So
Yeah. I feel like there are so many questions in what you just said, and I want to try to sort of address all of it because it's also critical. Talking about the task force for combating anti-Semitism is in some ways a very useful way to start, because that task force has sort of been a witness to, and in some ways an echo of all of the partisan battles that have started around the issue of anti-Semitism. So when the situation for Jews in Europe was just starting to get bad, in the early 2010s. AJC has a global presence. We have offices throughout Europe, in Asia, in Israel, in Abu Dhabi, et cetera. And our European offices were saying, this is something different. This is really bad. We need help. And AJC's CEO at that time went to Congress and spoke with a group of about a dozen members of Congress who had really been heroes and champions on this issue, and said, your voices are amazing, your leadership is strong, but united you can do more. And we need now a vehicle. We need some sort of task force, caucus, initiative that can be the point for all of the legislative activity to combat anti-Semitism. And they said, oh, yeah, there used to be something, and it hasn't been around for a few years, but you're right, we can revive this. And at that point, the task force was really focused on Europe. That was really the only part of the world that they were looking at, and found all sorts of ways to lean on European legislators and to have transatlantic conversations about anti-Semitism to try to help the Jewish communities there. They did great. They did a lot of good work. They really moved the needle in a lot of ways. Then, and this is when the challenges start to occur, right? Then things started getting bad in the United States. And originally at that point, right, think back to like Charlottesville and the white supremacists chanting, Jews will not replace us with their tiki torch Jews. It was sort of right-wing anti-Semitism. It was that white nationalist bent that hates Jews, and they were the ones shouting in the street. They were sort of the American threat. And in Congress, they didn't really want to tackle that. It felt sort of, it felt uncomfortable for a number of members of Congress, especially those, if we're being honest, right, on the right, who felt like, depending on what they said, if they didn't say it right, or if they didn't have quite the right tone, they might be offending voters, or people within their districts. So they sort of stopped. They didn't work on domestic anti-Semitism. And because it felt hypocritical to point a finger at other nations when anti-Semitism in the United States was such a prominent story in the news and such a serious issue, they sort of stopped working for a little while. And now, in a way, the task force and AJC and all of us working on anti-Semitism, I don't want to say we're lucky, but anti-Semitism comes from a lot of different sources. And this most recent wave that we were just talking about, the wave in response to the conflict in Israel, it wasn't coming from white supremacists or white nationalists or from the right. It was coming from the left. It's coming from the ultra progressive streams who are hypercritical of Israel. And so now, because we're getting it from the right and we're getting it from the left, it allows Congress to sort of be able to, I don't want to say like both sides the issue, but at least to be able to say, this is an issue that is affecting and coming from all facets of American society, every point on the political spectrum, and that empowers them to be able to do more.
So now you can actually have a vibrant debate where everybody is willing to be honest with each other.
Yeah, or at least point fingers equally, right?
Yeah.
if only one side was the recipient of the finger pointing, then it's a problem. But if both sides can kind of get it and feel it and hopefully also acknowledge it from their own, right? Like the fight against anti-Semitism will only get so far if it's Republicans calling out Democrats and Democrats calling out Republicans. But if they can each sort of recognize the threat posed both by the other and from themselves, that's when we can actually make progress.
Well, I think that's a great point. I mean, these are the challenges of bipartisanism, right?
Every day, all day, yes.
So last year, right before COVID hit, we were in Morocco, and the King of Morocco's senior advisor is one of the most prominent Jewish men in all of the Middle East, Mr. Andre Azoulay.
Yes.
And so he co-hosted a big event for us. We've been working on education in the space of freedom of religion or belief or conscience and pluralism all over the Middle East. We have programs in Iraq and Jordan, Lebanon, a number of other countries. We've done work in Morocco. And so they co-hosted this gathering of education leaders from the entire region. And we actually hosted it at the Mogador Association, so the House of Memory, which is this old Jewish synagogue that is now a museum, and it's brilliant. We have a video we can share with you, so it's really neat. But it was just such a powerful gathering for these leaders from the Middle East to come and to see how we've been teaching these concepts in schools and in a way that's culturally appropriate, that everybody feels comfortable. And it's like, yes, I want these freedoms for myself. It makes me feel better at who I am. I'm not trying to change you. And everybody else can have their freedom too. It was such a refreshing discussion to have, but it's rare that we have those kinds of conversations, even in our own country, unfortunately. And so I know how hard the work that you do is. But when I was in Morocco the first time in actually doing the trainings before this conference, so that was a few years ago now, and when we were launching the trainings, it was when Charlottesville was happening. And as you know, and I mean, Morocco has this historic Jewish heritage, and Andre was it was beautiful to see it there. But I remember being at that first training that we'd done with these Muslim Moroccan leaders, teachers, and just being so ashamed of what was happening in our own country, and just thinking, here's a country that is struggling on this issue of pluralism, but this year they actually are teaching Jewish history now in their schools for the first time, and they were really great.
Tina. It's amazing.
It's amazing. And Mr. Azoulay told us that he was so grateful for our work that didn't open the doors, but it just supported those efforts, that what he was doing. And I feel so honored by that. And then I feel so sad that across the pond they were literally shouting the kinds of things that they were doing. And in this past few months, the same thing that we saw from several groups, even as recently in Northern Virginia as last week, in graduation ceremonies being shouted. I think that this is an issue that we all need to take very seriously. Anti-Semitism isn't a Republican or Democratic problem or a white or black problem. It's a human problem, and it's been around for millennia, and we should be better than that. I think Ahmed Shaheed said it really well when he talks about anti-Semitism as this canary in the coal mine. And we often talk about religious freedom generally that way, but I think when you look at how the Jewish community in particular is disproportionately the most persecuted group. It says a lot about a population and how they treat Jewish people. So I'm grateful for the work that you are trudging along, trying to do, because it is so important. And it's just saddening to me to see the extent to which it's become normal to have this kind of anti-Semitism flourishing in our own society. I think it's a harsh indication of where we're at as a society. So
Yeah.
anyway.
No, you're right. Thank you for that. And really thank you for what you helped to advance in Morocco, because undeniably that is an unprecedented, amazing shift that Moroccan kids are going to learn about the Jewish history of Morocco in the school system. It's amazing. I'm really glad you mentioned Ahmed Shaheed, because like, talk about groundbreaking, right? He issued this report in the UN, a place known to have bias against Israel, at least, if not to say some underpinnings of anti-Semitism. Some would say that. He issued this report about anti-Semitism as a human rights issue, and like fundamentally changed the perception, I think, within the UN and for a lot of people, right, who sort of put anti-Semitism in a different basket, right? And now every time the UN is talking about anti-Semitism, they point to that report. And now there's, again, after far too long, a focal point at the UN for addressing anti-Semitism, Miguel Moratino. So like, step by step, the world is finding ways to address this issue. And I think that's really important. And sort of thinking about Ahmed Shaheed and the changing of the framing of anti-Semitism to be a human rights issue. One of the things that I don't want to say regret, because hindsight is 2020, but I wish that when we were involved in the Earth Caucus, pushing international religious freedom, then we had thought more about anti-Semitism, because at that point it just wasn't a bubbling hot button issue, but it was still there. It was sort of underneath the surface. And I really wish that we'd been able to talk about anti-Semitism as a religious freedom issue. And part of me also wonders, like, if there weren't this amazing, vibrant task force for combating anti-Semitism in the House and the Senate, would the International Religious Freedom Caucus be more willing to take up that banner? Like, are we, because we have specific channels to address this, are we missing really obvious ways for people to be involved and to be allies in fighting this fight?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I know that we did do several events with the Anti-Semitism Caucus and with just on anti-Semitism, or with the Helsinki Commission on it over the years, but I don't remember what we worked on, when we were there together, or which ones, what years those were. But thankfully, I think one of the big issues that I remember at the time was a lot of the graveyard issues, and just the excavation, the destruction of graveyards, and certain reparations or issues that were taking place in Europe that Congressman Chris Smith was so strong on. And, at the time we had such a great stalwart in Tom Lantos, a survivor of the Holocaust, who was a sitting member of Congress on top, at the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and, a constant reminder. And I think in many ways, if you think about it, back then, maybe we didn't have the issues because we had somebody that was a reminder that helped people come together and see face to face.
Yeah.
This is the suffering that people face. And so they weren't as opposed to each other. It is really unfortunate, but at the State Department, these issues are separated from the IRF office and the anti-Semitism office. I worked on the board of a foundation down here in Richmond, Virginia, the First Freedom Center, with the former ambassador for anti-Semitism. And so it was a freedom of religion group. And so we worked very closely on it down here in Richmond. But yeah, these are issues that should be going hand in hand across the board. And the more that especially in today's space, that we can do that, the better. And over the years, I think that community there's like Rabbi Saperstein, who became the ambassador for religious freedom for a short period, which was amazing. Really exemplified that connection. I mean, he's probably a perfect example of it, but we don't always have those. And so to the extent that we can begin to see them hand in hand, I think, or the intersectionality of them, it's important. So there were two other caucuses, Julie, that you worked on.
Yes.
And I don't know when you started them, so you'll have to tell me, but the Congressional Caucus on Black-Jewish Relations, and then the Congressional Hellenic-Israel Alliance, which I think may have been there when I was there. So what can you tell me about the two of those and why they were formed, and what was your partner? What are they focused on right now?
I love this conversation.
Yeah.
I would also be remiss if I didn't say that preceding my time at AJC, the organization helped to start a Jewish Latino Congressional Caucus.
Oh, wow, good.
That's around 2011. So before my time, I wasn't involved, but I'm absolutely involved now in keeping that going. It's still a very robust bipartisan place for having conversations about anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-Semitism, the relationships between the US, Israel, and lots of Latin American countries, immigration, lots of really key issues.
Well, that's really fun, because what most people don't know is a lot of the Cuban refugees, actually, I mean, a lot of them are Jewish.
Yeah, call them Jubins.
Jubins?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna have to tell my friend. He didn't know.
Your friend knows. I promise your friend knows.
No, he always thought he was like an Afro-Latino. Now he's a Jubin. Okay.
He's both.
Both, okay. All right. So tell us about the caucuses.
So the Congressional Caucus on Black-Jewish Relations is the most recent. We started the House Caucus for Black-Jewish Relations in 2019. We launched it from our global forum, our annual conference stage. And it was a really interesting kind of dynamic, because most caucuses, I think, are started in response to a national need, right? Like there's something happening in America that Congress can address. And this caucus almost started in the opposite way. There was something happening in Congress that they wanted to address. And that was that historically throughout the civil rights movement, and a little bit beyond, the African-American and Jewish members of Congress worked together constantly. They were sort of in a lockstep, and they were the, like in some ways, primary drivers of social justice issues in the American Congress.
Well, it's actually a huge part of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King marched with several major Jewish leaders, and most people don't even know that.
Yeah, Rabbi Heschel, and he was guided by a number of Jewish leaders, and then of course the lynching of Cheney and Goodman, and like all of those things. But it was sort of withering, right? Like those relationships weren't as strong as they used to be, and for lots of kind of societal reasons, there ended up being a disconnect and almost a bit of distrust. Instead of being with each other all the time, the members were sort of isolated, and they weren't coming together to talk about issues of common concern. And Brenda Lawrence, a representative from Detroit, who's a Black Democrat, said, this is a problem, right? Like, I thought it would be different when I got to Congress. I thought that I would be meeting with the Jews and like having these conversations, that like we would be the people talking about social justice issues in Congress. But it wasn't happening. So she got together with a number of other Blacks and Jews in the Congress to sort of start this conversation, say like, why aren't we talking? And it became really clear that people wanted it, but they didn't have the vehicle. They didn't have that like a natural convening point. Elsie Hastings had done a Black Jewish breakfast every year for decades.
Wow.
Once a year. It was once a year. So they would like meet for an hour and a half, have a good conversation, but then there wasn't that like chance for follow-up. So Brenda Lawrence went to Elsie Hastings. She went to John Lewis. She went to Debbie Wasserman Schultz, to Lee Zeldin, one of the two Jewish Republicans, and Will Hurd, at that point, the one African-American Republican, and said, we need to have a bipartisan caucus to talk about Black-Jewish relations. And they started, and it immediately became this like very fertile ground for both sort of policy work, but also in some ways sort of intercommunal therapy. It was so vitally needed. And it's been so successful and so appreciated both in Congress and by the communities across the nation that now we've just started a Senate caucus on Black-Jewish relations that was launched from AJC's virtual global forum stage, because we're virtual still, just a few weeks ago, started by Jackie Rosen, Tim Scott, and Cory Booker. So
wow, that's amazing.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
That's really exciting. Well, I want to hear about the other caucus, but how has the Black Lives Matter movement affected some of the work of that caucus?
So it's really interesting that you asked that, because we, I think their impact is not strong yet in Congress, right? Like in Congress, when a member of Congress needs sort of the insight or the backing from the African American community, they're still going to the older establishment organizations. They're going to the Urban League, they're going to the NAACP and others. Because the movement for Black Lives was so sort of organic and in some ways disparate, they don't have like the organizational impact yet in Congress. So it hasn't really yet. I don't want to say that it won't, because I think that they're very nascent in their organizing. But at this point, we haven't heard a lot from them. Much more from like sort of the Urban League, the NAACP, those established organizational partners.
So what can you tell me about the Hellenic-Israel Alliance? And I think Gus Bilirakis must be on that one. Is that right?
He's one of the co-founders and co-chairs.
I think it may have started when I was there then. I'm trying to remember.
I think so. It was right around 2013.
Okay, maybe after I left, but I kind of remember it.
And
yeah.
It's an amazing story. So Gus Bilirakis he was in Chicago. I think he was, going to meet with some people and do some campaign work or whatnot. And he was in a conference room with a lot of Greek Americans and a lot of Jewish Americans, right? And he, in very typical, and anyone who knows Gus Bilirakis will appreciate this, sort of looked around the room and was like, Greeks and Jews, like we have a lot in common. We should start a caucus. And I think he was almost joking, but it was that like seed of an idea that both like stayed in his head, but then also like for the Greeks and Jews in that room, they were like, ooh, yeah, a caucus, like this is a good idea. And it was at a critical moment, right? It was right when Greece and Cyprus and Israel and that whole Eastern Mediterranean were discovering their energy resources. And realizing that they needed to be cooperating to address and to really fully exploit in a positive way, the natural gas and the other energy resources that they were just starting to learn that they had. So Gus Bilirakis got together with Ted Deutsch and they said, we're going to start this caucus. And it was, I would say primarily at that point and still to today, an initiative really backed by two organizations, AJC and HELC, the Hellenic American Leadership Council. And Gus Bilirakis and Ted Deutsch would convene AJC and HELC and a bunch of other Jewish and Greek organizations like once a week to start having conversations about this. And in the end, like it was just AJC and HELC really that were showing up. And he was like, okay, now we're moving. Like now we know like what we can do and we know which directions we can go and which organizations are going to support us. And, that was already, almost 10 years ago. And the caucus has almost 50 members. And in some ways, it's still this very model caucus because most caucuses are like bilateral, right? There's like US Ireland, US England, US Japan. This is not just bilateral, trilateral, it's quadrilateral because it's Greece, Cyprus, Israel, and the United States, and all the embassies are really involved. And it's sort of created, in a lot of ways, this American perception of the Eastern Mediterranean as a region, when before it was just like, oh, Israel's in the Middle East and Greece and Cyprus are in Europe. But the reality is Israel to Cyprus is the same as like the US to Cuba, right? Like it's super close. So being able to sort of carve that out has been really fundamental for them and for us in the United States.
Well, and most people have no idea of how important caucuses are to building relationships across party lines, to actually getting things done. And those relationships are really critical to the policy and everything else that we try to do. So, and, finding commonalities in Congress is critical if you're going to get anything done. So,
yes.
And it makes
bipartisan commonalities, right?
Yeah,
like at a
right.
time when people aren't having conversations across the aisle, caucuses can be that bridge.
And who wouldn't like to eat Greek and Jewish food? So,
all day long.
Everything else. So it's like, I'm sure you got a lot of foodies in that group too.
It's an interesting combination of people really concerned about defense issues and people who want to eat.
Yeah. Well, I know that because I worked for Gus after I left the other office, and he was amazing. But his group, whatever the Greek day was every year, and all of his relatives that would come in and cook for it, was probably one of the most, looked forward to days of the year for everybody in Congress. And his aunt or his sister still won't give us her recipe for the baklava, but
I think it doesn't work if you're not Greek. Like, I just think we could try it, but.
Someone asked me for my recipe to make refried beans, and I'm like, look, it took me 20 years to figure it out. I can give it to you. It's like beans and water, but they probably aren't going to turn out the same. I'm just telling you.
Okay. That's an important thing to know. Pork or no pork?
No pork, but you can always add it. I have a cousin who's vegetarian, so I have to be thoughtful of her.
Very nice. And inclusive of any Jews and Muslims in your midst as well.
Exactly. Yes. We can make it both ways.
Yeah. Always modeling religious freedom.
Try. Julie, thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure. I'm so glad to talk to you about these issues.